The auction house was a cacophony of murmurs, the air thick with excitement, the scent of hay and dust mixing with the scent of anticipation. Spectators moved in clusters, some lingering by the paddocks, others standing near the ring, eagerly sizing up the horses paraded before them. The barn was alive with the hushed conversations of well-dressed men and women, all there for one reason, to find their next prized possession. The horses, sleek and majestic, stood proudly on display, but there was one that stood apart from the others. The stallion was different. His coat was a rich chestnut, shimmering under the lights, and his mane flowed like liquid silk in the gentle breeze. Yet, despite his stunning appearance, there was something about his presence that unsettled the crowd. His eyes, they were the first thing anyone noticed. They were a deep, soulful brown, but they spoke of something much darker than the beauty of his form. They spoke of pain, rejection, and abandonment, the kind of sorrow that no amount of grooming or care could heal. The other horses on display seemed to stand proudly, their heads high, tails flicking with the anticipation of their new owners. They looked eager, perhaps even excited about their future. But not the stallion. This one seemed different, as if he had already given up on the world around him. His posture sagged, his head low, and though he was still physically strong, there was an overwhelming sense of resignation about him. It was as if he already knew his fate, that whatever happened here today would be nothing but another chapter in his sad, forgotten story. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the barn, his words cutting through the quiet murmurings of the crowd. "Lot number 13, he announced, his tone filled with a practiced enthusiasm. "A majestic stallion, once the pride of the racing circuit. He's a fine horse, healthy, but, let's be honest, his time has passed. A few rides left in him at most." He paused, scanning the crowd with a steely gaze. "Do we have any bids?" A heavy silence settled over the room, thick and suffocating. A few people shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting toward the stallion, then quickly away. Some of them exchanged quiet words, but no one raised a hand. No one made a move. The auctioneer glanced down at his papers and cleared his throat, as though preparing for another attempt. "A fine horse, really," he added, his voice a little softer, a touch more persuasive. "Good pedigree. His time on the track is behind him, sure, but he's still got some years left. He could still be a great companion, a fine addition to any stable." The stallion stood unmoving, his dark eyes scanning the room, but his gaze never lingered on anyone for too long. His once proud form now seemed diminished, a shadow of its former self. He was a reminder of the passage of time, a living embodiment of fading glory. From the back of the room, a young man stood, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket, his face drawn and weary. He wasn't like the others. He didn't have the polished appearance of the other bidders, the moneyed look of those who could afford to purchase a champion. His clothes were simple, worn from years of hard work, and there was a tiredness to his eyes that suggested a life lived not in the lap of luxury, but in struggle and survival. He wasn't a horse enthusiast. In fact, he had never owned a horse in his life. His family had never been involved in the equestrian world, and his knowledge of horses extended only to the most basic of understanding. Yet, there was something about this stallion, something in the way the horse stood there, so beaten down and forlorn, that struck a chord deep within him. The sadness in the stallion's eyes mirrored something within him, a kind of sorrow he had come to know all too well. The young man knew what it was like to feel forgotten, to feel like your best days were behind you, to be rejected by those who once admired you. The crowd around him seemed to grow more uneasy, a wave of discomfort spreading through the room. And then, almost without thinking, he raised his hand. "I'll take him." His voice was quiet, but it was enough to draw attention. There was a ripple of surprise that passed through the crowd. Some people scoffed under their breath, others exchanged incredulous glances. They couldn't fathom why anyone would want a horse like this, a horse whose glory days were so clearly behind him. Why would anyone buy a horse that had already been left behind by the world? The auctioneer paused, a slight flicker of surprise crossing his face before he quickly regained his composure. He had been hoping for more bids, but the young man's offer was enough to close the deal. "Sold," the auctioneer said with a nod, his voice laced with a hint of amusement. To the young man in the back. A murmur spread through the room. The horse was sold. For a moment, there was only the sound of feet shuffling, the odd exchange of whispers, and the dull creak of the barn as the weight of what had just happened settled into the atmosphere. The young man slowly made his way down the aisle, his footsteps echoing against the wood, his eyes never leaving the stallion. He wasn't sure what he had just done, but something about it felt right. He had made the decision without fully thinking it through, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was where he was meant to be. He wasn't rich and he certainly wasn't qualified to be a horse owner, but there was a bond he felt with this animal, a connection that he couldn't quite explain. The stallion stood still, his head slightly lowered, as though acknowledging the young man's presence but saying nothing. It was as if he knew what was coming next, as though he had given up on ever finding a place in this world again. But there was something about the young man that made him feel, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The young man reached the stallion, his hand slowly reaching out to touch the horse's mane. He didn't speak. There was no need for words. He didn't know what the future held for them, but in that moment they shared something unspoken, a shared sense of being lost, of being out of place. And perhaps a glimmer of hope. The auction house was quiet once again, but for the young man and the horse, it was the beginning of something far more profound than the room could ever understand. The world outside was full of people who had passed them by, but together they would find a way to move forward, one step at a time. The stable was cold that evening, the wind howling outside, its mournful sound creeping through the cracks in the old wooden walls. The gusts rattled the loose boards and swirled the straw on the ground, carrying with them the scent of winter's approach. Inside, however, it was still, save for the occasional shifting of hay or the faint creak of a beam above. The dim light of a single lantern cast long shadows across the barn, illuminating only a small portion of the floor and the lone figure standing in front of the stall. Gabriel's breath was visible in the frigid air, and his worn boots crunched lightly on the hay as he approached the horse. Thunder, as Gabriel had decided to call him, stood in the far corner of his stall, motionless. His chestnut coat, though dull from lack of care, gleamed faintly in the flickering light. The horse's large frame loomed in the shadowed corner, almost otherworldly, as though he were some ancient creature from another time. Despite the loneliness of the stable, the stallion was silent, still, and so very distant from the energy that had once pulsed through him. Gabriel watched him for a long moment, feeling a strange connection in his heart. The wind outside howled louder, but it didn't seem to matter to the stallion. He was a statue, frozen in time. Gabriel took a step closer, his heart heavy with understanding. "You don't belong here, do you?" Gabriel murmured, his voice soft and introspective, almost as if speaking to himself. He felt foolish for talking to a horse, but there was something about Thunder that made words come naturally. The stallion's ears twitched. Slowly he lifted his head. His deep brown eyes, clouded with years of neglect, turned toward Gabriel. For a fleeting moment, there was something in them, a flicker of life, a faint glimmer of recognition. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a jolt of hope through Gabriel. The horse was no longer as vacant as before. There was something there, a spark, a trace of the fire he used to have. Gabriel took another step forward, his eyes locked on the stallion. He didn't know what had happened to Thunder. The horse's history was a mystery. But Gabriel could see the signs of a once great creature whose spirit had been broken. The bruises of abandonment were visible in his posture, in the way he held his head low and his body tense, like a warrior who had long since been defeated, yet still bore the weight of old battles. Thunder was a reminder of what it meant to be forgotten, left to rot in the shadows. But Gabriel was determined to change that. He had never been rich, had never come from a family of horse breeders or trainers, but he knew one thing. He understood horses. More importantly, he understood their hearts. He had spent his childhood working with them, learning their ways, listening to their silent language. And this horse? Thunder was special. He had been discarded, rejected by those who should have cared for him, but Gabriel saw what others didn't. He saw the warrior beneath the sorrow. He saw a fighter who, despite everything, still had a pulse, still had the potential to rise again. "I'll call you Thunder," Gabriel whispered, his words barely above the sound of the wind. Because I believe you have a storm inside you still. There was something almost sacred about the moment, something that felt destined. Gabriel had never intended to buy a horse, and certainly never imagined buying one so broken. But the instant he saw Thunder, he knew that they were meant to be together. The name felt right. Thunder was a reflection of what he saw in the stallion. He didn't know how or why, but Gabriel believed there was still power in this horse, a fierce energy waiting to be unlocked. Thunder's ears flicked again, and for a brief second, he lowered his head as if considering the name. Then, almost imperceptibly, he shifted his weight, turning toward Gabriel as though in acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Gabriel smiled, his heart swelling with a quiet sort of pride. He took another slow step forward and reached out, extending his hand. His fingers brushed against Thunder's mane, and the horse flinched just slightly before standing still. Gabriel wasn't surprised. After all, Thunder had been abandoned and neglected, and trust wasn't something easily earned. But Gabriel didn't mind the hesitation. He didn't need Thunder to trust him right away. He was patient. He understood that some wounds took longer to heal. That night, Thunder stood in his stall, still gazing out into the night. The wind howled outside, but Thunder remained unmoving, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. The barn was silent, save for the occasional rustling of hay, but there was a palpable change in the air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Thunder felt it. Deep inside, something had shifted. There was a flicker of hope, a spark that he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. For years, Thunder had known nothing but rejection and solitude. He had been discarded by the very people who had once praised him, his glory days fading into the past like the echoes of a forgotten race. He had been cast aside, left to live out his days in silence, his only company the shadows of his own memories. But now, standing in the quiet barn, Thunder felt something different. There was a warmth in the air, a presence beside him that wasn't cold or distant. Gabriel's quiet voice, the soft touch of his hand, all of it was new, unfamiliar. But there was a sincerity in Gabriel's eyes that made Thunder believe, just for a moment, that he hadn't been forgotten. And so, the night stretched on, and the two of them stood together in the stillness. A broken horse and a young man who had found something in him that others had missed. In the dark of the stable, Thunder felt the stirrings of something inside him. Something fierce, something alive. A storm, perhaps, but also a heart that still beat strong. The wind outside howled, but within the stable, a new chapter was beginning, and it was one neither of them had ever expected. The days turned into weeks, and Gabriel worked tirelessly with Thunder. Each morning, he rose before the sun, the world still wrapped in the cool embrace of dawn, to care for the stallion. He wasn't a trained horseman, not by any stretch of the imagination. But he had a deep understanding of animals, of their souls and their hearts, and he was willing to put everything he had into helping Thunder find his way back. It wasn't easy. Thunder was distrustful, hesitant, and at times downright wild. The scars from his past weren't just physical, they were etched into the horse's psyche. Every time Gabriel tried to get close, Thunder would flinch, his eyes wide with suspicion. The slightest movement would send him into a frenzy, and more than once, Gabriel found himself caught off guard by the stallion's raw power. Thunder had been hurt in ways that were hard to imagine. The harsh hands that had once ridden him, the cruel voices that had dismissed him as worthless, still lingered in his memory. Each attempt to connect was met with a flash of terror, a raw need to escape, and Gabriel couldn't blame him. He knew that this was not going to be a quick fix, but he was determined. The work would be slow and it would be painful, but he was committed. Despite the setbacks, Gabriel refused to give up. He believed in Thunder, believed that somewhere beneath the layers of fear and anger, the horse still had the heart of a warrior. And he was willing to fight for it, even if it meant spending every waking moment trying to gain Thunder's trust. He started with the basics. At first, Gabriel would simply sit outside the stall, letting Thunder watch him from a safe distance. He didn't try to get too close, didn't rush him. Each day, he would brush the stallion's coat with slow, deliberate movements, always speaking softly, always calm. Thunder didn't respond at first. He would stand stiff and unmoving, eyes wide and full of distrust. But Gabriel was patient, repeating the process over and over again, never pushing too hard, never forcing the bond. When Gabriel moved to the pasture, he would walk alongside Thunder, keeping a safe distance but always present. He didn't chase the horse, didn't try to control him. Instead, he moved with him, allowing the stallion to set the pace. Over time, Thunder began to recognize that Gabriel wasn't a threat, that he wasn't like the others who had come before him. Slowly, the walls around Thunder's heart began to crumble, though the process was painstakingly slow. Days passed and Gabriel's resolve never wavered. The world around them began to shift. Thunder's coat grew shinier, his frame more muscular, his spirit a little less burdened by the weight of his past. The stallion began to respond to Gabriel's voice, his movements becoming less hesitant, less fearful. Yet there was still a distance between them, a chasm that seemed too wide to cross. But Gabriel didn't give up. He knew that true healing didn't happen in an instant. It was a process, a slow dance that required patience and trust. One crisp morning, Gabriel made his way to the pasture as he had countless times before. The sun had barely begun to rise, the first light of the day casting a soft glow over the dew-covered grass. The air was sharp and cool, and the ground beneath Gabriel's boots was still damp from the night's chill. He could see Thunder grazing in the distance, his head lowered as he nibbled on the grass. As Gabriel approached, he could feel a shift in the air, something different about today. For the first time in weeks, Thunder didn't pull away. He stood still, his body tense, but his eyes locked on Gabriel, his gaze steady and focused. There was no fear, no hesitation. It was as if the stallion had made a decision, a quiet understanding between them, a mutual acknowledgement that this moment was different. Gabriel stopped a few feet away, his breath visible in the cold morning air. He didn't move, didn't try to reach out just yet. He wanted to give Thunder space to let the horse decide when it was time. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the soft rustle of grass. Gabriel's heart beat in his chest, the anticipation making his palms sweat despite the chill in the air. And then, with a movement that was slow but deliberate, Gabriel extended his hand. He didn't rush, didn't force it, just offered it in quiet trust. Thunder's eyes remained locked on him, unwavering. The stallion took a step forward, his muscles rippling beneath his coat, the tension in his body palpable. For a moment, Gabriel thought that maybe, just maybe, Thunder would back away again, retreating into the comfort of his solitary world. But then something incredible happened. Thunder's nostrils flared slightly, and with a gentle snort, the stallion moved closer. He lowered his head and for the first time he nuzzled Gabriel's outstretched hand. It wasn't forceful, it wasn't frantic. It was a quiet acceptance, a small but significant connection. Gabriel's breath caught in his throat. His heart surged with emotion as he stood there, hand outstretched, feeling the warmth of Thunder's muzzle against his palm. It was a moment of pure, unspoken understanding. A moment that could never be rushed, a moment that Gabriel knew they both needed. He could feel the horse's heart, steady and strong, beneath the uncertainty, beneath the old scars. They were no longer two strangers. They were partners, connected in a way that words could never capture. "Good boy," Gabriel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. His hand moved slowly, gently, along Thunder's muzzle, as if to reassure the horse that he was safe. "We're in this together." Thunder's ears flicked, and for a brief moment, Gabriel thought he could see the tiniest spark of something in those deep brown eyes. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sorrow. It was something else, something new, something hopeful. And in that moment, Gabriel knew that the journey they had begun wasn't just about training a horse. It was about healing, not just Thunder's wounds but his own as well. Together they would face the storms of the past and forge a new future. A year passed and Thunder had transformed. His coat, once dull and matted, now shone a rich, radiant chestnut, each strand of hair gleaming in the sunlight. The wildness that had once consumed him, the fear, the distrust, had been replaced by a quiet grace. His muscles, once tense and strained from the weight of his past, were now toned and strong, moving with purpose and elegance. He had become a horse of beauty, of power. But there was still one thing left to prove. Thunder wasn't just a horse for show. He wasn't a prized possession to be admired from a distance. No, Thunder was a champion. He was a fighter, and that spirit still burned within him. The fire that had been extinguished in the shadows of his past had been reignited by Gabriel's patience and belief. But now it was time to test that spirit, to prove that Thunder was more than just a survivor. Gabriel had spent the past year working with Thunder, nurturing him, teaching him, and, above all, gaining his trust. But there was still something missing. They had come so far together, but there was no way to prove the depth of their connection, the strength of their bond. Until now. With little money to his name, Gabriel entered Thunder into a local race. It wasn't the grandest of events, not by a long shot. The race was a small, humble gathering with local horse owners and their steeds. Most of the competitors were young, fast, and well-trained, their bloodlines boasting pedigrees that stretched back for generations. Their horses were built for speed, bred for greatness. Thunder, on the other hand, had no such lineage. He had nothing but his spirit, the heart of a warrior that Gabriel had helped to reawaken. The decision wasn't an easy one. Gabriel knew the odds were stacked against them. Thunder had never raced before, and his body, while strong, wasn't the finely tuned machine that the other horses were. But Gabriel had something that no pedigree could measure: belief. He believed in Thunder, and that belief ran deeper than any bloodline or training. This race wasn't just for the win, it was a chance to show the world that Thunder still had the heart of a champion. The morning of the race arrived, and the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The stands were packed with spectators, their excited murmurs blending with the sound of the horses' hooves in the paddock. Gabriel led Thunder to the starting line, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of every gaze on him, on his horse, on their unlikely partnership. But Thunder was calm. His deep brown eyes were locked on the track ahead, focused, determined. There was no fear in him now, no hesitation. He was ready. As Gabriel mounted Thunder, the crowd fell silent, the only sounds the rustling of banners and the soft thuds of horses' hooves against the dirt. Gabriel's hands gripped the reins, his heart racing, but he could feel the steadiness of Thunder beneath him, his powerful muscles shifting under the weight of his rider. There was no panic, no uncertainty. Just a calm focus. Thunder was no longer the wild, frightened stallion he had once been. He was a horse with purpose. The race began with the shrill blast of a horn, and the horses surged forward. Thunder's hooves hit the dirt with a force that made Gabriel's body tremble, but he didn't falter. He was with the pack, neck and neck with the fastest of the horses. His body moved as one with the rhythm of the race, his legs stretching out in long, powerful strides. Thunder had always been fast, but now he was more than that. He wasn't just running. He was flying, each stride propelling him forward with a ferocity Gabriel had never seen in him before. The other horses pushed ahead, their sleek bodies cutting through the air with practiced precision. Some were already pulling ahead, their riders urging them on, encouraging them to go faster. But Thunder didn't back down. His heart was beating faster now, but it wasn't fear that fueled him. It was the will to prove something. It was the need to show that he was not forgotten, not useless. He was more than just a horse that had been discarded. He was Thunder, and he would never be overlooked again. Gabriel's voice was a soft whisper in his ear, urging him on. "You can do this, boy. Just a little longer." Thunder's muscles burned with effort, but he didn't stop. He dug deeper, finding reserves of strength he hadn't known he had. The horses ahead of him were fast, but Gabriel could feel Thunder gaining ground inch by inch. The finish line was in sight, and Thunder's chestnut coat gleamed in the sunlight, the sweat on his body a testament to the effort he was putting in. His focus was absolute, and as the crowd cheered in the distance, Thunder surged forward, faster than anyone had expected. With only a few meters to go, Thunder pushed ahead, his legs driving him forward with a raw, unrelenting power. The other horses, though still ahead, couldn't match his pace. One by one, Thunder passed them, his body working like a well-oiled machine, but it was more than that. It was the spirit of the horse, the fire that burned in his chest, pushing him past his limits. He wasn't just racing to win. He was racing to show the world that he was still a champion. Thunder crossed the finish line first, leaving the other horses in his wake. The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of sound that seemed to echo through the air. Gabriel sat atop Thunder, his hands tight on the reins, his heart racing in his chest. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe that the horse he had saved, the horse who had once been broken and abandoned, had just won the race. Tears filled Gabriel's eyes as he slid off Thunder's back, his hands trembling as he patted the stallion's neck. "We did it, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We really did it." Thunder stood still, his chest heaving with exhaustion, but there was a quiet pride in his eyes. He had done it. They had done it together. The crowd continued to cheer, but Gabriel didn't hear them. He didn't need to. All that mattered in that moment was the horse standing before him, the bond they had forged, the journey they had been through. Thunder had proven himself not just to the world but to himself. And as Gabriel stood there holding Thunder's reins, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. They had taken the first step together, and there was no limit to what they could achieve. Together they would face whatever came next, no matter the challenge. Thunder had found his place. And Gabriel had found his champion. The next day, Gabriel and Thunder were no longer the underdogs. The news of their victory spread like wildfire, carried through whispers and excited murmurs across town. What had started as a humble race, with an unassuming man and a forgotten horse, had become a story that captured the hearts of many. People came from all over to see the horse that had once been rejected, the horse who had been cast aside like an old, useless tool, now standing proudly as a champion. Photographers took pictures, reporters gathered around to ask questions, and local horse enthusiasts marveled at Thunder's transformation. They spoke of his power, his speed, and the grace with which he had carried himself during the race. Gabriel tried to maintain his composure amidst the growing attention, but the constant influx of visitors was overwhelming. Everyone wanted a piece of the story, a glimpse of the horse who had defied expectations. They saw Thunder's victory as a testament to triumph over adversity, and perhaps in some ways they were right. But for Gabriel, it wasn't about the fame or the prize money. He hadn't done it for the accolades, nor did he seek recognition for himself. It wasn't the glory of the win that mattered. It was the bond he'd formed with Thunder, the way they had fought together side by side, not just for a race but for a second chance at life. Gabriel had given Thunder a chance to be more than just a symbol of defeat and abandonment. And in return, Thunder had given him something far more valuable, the knowledge that even in the darkest moments hope could still thrive. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, Gabriel stood beside Thunder in the pasture, watching him graze peacefully on the lush, green grass. The air was warm and still, the kind of evening where everything seemed to pause and breathe together. Thunder's coat, now gleaming with health, rippled with every movement of his strong muscles. His once wild, fiery eyes were now calm, content, and free from the deep sorrow that had once clouded them. Gabriel stepped closer to the horse, his heart full of something he couldn't quite put into words. He reached out slowly, his hand brushing through Thunder's thick mane. The softness of the horse's fur under his fingertips was a reminder of how far they had come, of the long road they had traveled together. Gabriel's touch was gentle, tender, as though the act itself carried all the quiet understanding and unspoken promises between them. "I knew you had it in you," Gabriel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Thunder paused, his head still lowered to the grass. Slowly, almost as if sensing the weight of Gabriel's words, he raised his head and turned to face him. Their eyes met, a gaze that spoke volumes. Thunder's deep brown eyes, once filled with sorrow, now shone with something different. It wasn't just calmness. It was gratitude. Gabriel could see it, a quiet appreciation, a flicker of understanding that Thunder had never offered before. It wasn't the look of a horse who had been saved. It was the look of a partner who had been through the trials and emerged stronger together. The bond between them was no longer just that of caretaker and animal. It had become something deeper, something unbreakable. They had given each other something that no race or victory could ever measure. In that moment, Gabriel realized that the greatest victory wasn't the race. It wasn't the applause from the crowd or the headlines in the newspapers. It wasn't even the prize money that had allowed him to finally breathe a little easier. No, the greatest victory was far simpler than that. It was the fact that he had given Thunder the one thing no one else had: love. Thunder had been abandoned, forgotten by those who had once used him, cast aside when he could no longer meet their demands. But Gabriel had seen something more in him. Where others had seen a broken horse, Gabriel had seen a soul that was worth saving. And through the long, patient months of working together, they had both healed in ways they never thought possible. The bond they shared was something that transcended words. It was a quiet understanding, a mutual respect that needed no validation. Gabriel had given Thunder the freedom to be himself, to find his own strength, and Thunder had given Gabriel the courage to believe in second chances, not just for horses but for people too. Thunder lowered his head once more, gently nuzzling Gabriel's hand in a soft, almost affectionate gesture. It was a gesture of trust, of knowing that they were in this together, no matter what the future held. Gabriel smiled, feeling a lump rise in his throat as he looked into those trusting eyes. It had been a long, hard road, but it had been worth every single moment. "I'll always be here for you," Gabriel whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. And Thunder, as if understanding the depth of the promise, gave a soft snort, his body relaxing as he resumed grazing. Gabriel watched him for a moment longer, taking in the serene beauty of the scene before him. The world around them seemed to stand still, the weight of the past slowly lifting, replaced by something brighter, something full of promise. It wasn't just Thunder who had been given a second chance. Gabriel had been given one too, a chance to rebuild his life, to find purpose, and to believe in something greater than himself. Together they had proven that even in the face of adversity, there was always hope, always a path forward. For the first time in a long time, Gabriel felt a sense of peace settle over him. The future was unknown and there would still be challenges ahead. But as long as he had Thunder by his side, he knew they could face anything. Together they had built something that could never be taken away. A new beginning had arrived, not just for Thunder but for Gabriel as well. And whatever came next, they would face it together.